As we navigate our way through these turbulent times, Professor Tracey Rowland writes, more and more Catholics are discovering that Joseph Ratzinger, also known as Pope Benedict XVI, was not just a shy man who enjoyed writing books, listening to Mozart, and feeding stray cats, but a church doctor with an absolutely reliable sense for where the theological true north lies. Tracey Rowland, Benedict XVI scholar and St. John Paul II Chair of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, on the faith and thought of the late, great Pope Benedict XVI, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization and Culture podcast from Word on Fire. Professor Tracey Rowland is a world-renowned theologian. Holding graduate degrees in political philosophy and German, she received her doctorate from Cambridge and pontifical degrees from the Pontifical Lateran University. She served as Dean of the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family in Melbourne, Australia from 2001 to 2017 and currently holds the St. John Paul II Chair of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, Australia. She has had the honor of serving on the 9th International Theological Commission. And Tracey has published 8 outstanding books, my favorite being Ratzinger's Faith, the Theology of Pope Benedict XVI, hundreds of articles, dozens of book chapters, and serves on the editorial board of Communio, International Catholic Review. Tracey is a recipient of many awards, including the 2020 Ratzinger Prize. Tracey, welcome.
Thank you so much, Todd. I always enjoy working with American Catholics, where I think we're kind of... I don't know, that I have a strong sense of affinity with the American Catholic world, so it's a great honor to be invited. Thank you.
Segment 1, Beginnings. Having been educated and formed at the Rockhampton Diocese primary schools of St. Mary's College and Our Lady's Catholic School, the principal who acknowledged that you might one day amount to something told your grandmother, Tracey, that she had to do some pruning to sort out the defects in your character. Later, this same nun warned you that if you ever abandoned the Catholic faith, she would return from the dead and haunt you. Tracey, what role did nuns and their Catholic schools play in your faith?
I think they had an enormous role in my early faith formation. I think I got my Christianity from my Anglican grandmother, or in the States you would say Episcopalian grandmother.
Sure.
She was the first person to teach me prayers, and she was a faithful Christian lady. And my mother would also say prayers with me when I was a little child. But the nuns who taught me in primary school were, they were the sort of the genuine article. They were holy women. They were extraordinary women, and they were not people who taught religious education for 3 or 4 hours a week. Everything they did, every hour of instruction in the classroom, it was all deeply Catholic, and I was just so fortunate to have them. The particular sister you mentioned, Sister Mary Clotilde, she was the youngest of 13 children, and she grew up on a property in outback Australia, and she was short, and she was this kind of character who, although she was short, she controlled the whole school, and parents were sort of scared of her. If she said jump, everyone jumped. She had enormous authority, but very, very deep faith, and I think because she had grown up in outback Australia, she wasn't naive about the world. And, she would often give us little pieces of advice on life after school. And she was determined, that she was, sending people out to be Catholics in the world. And that was her mission. And yes, I owe so much to her.
Well, and knowing how you turned out so well and such a champion of the Catholic faith, obviously there's been no hauntings, it sounds like.
No, there's been no hauntings, but there was a time in Cambridge when I really was being persecuted by, a chap who was passionately anti-theistic. Yes. He was a professor, and he didn't want Christians of any kind getting through the doctoral programs. And he was really on my case. And I prayed to her. And the next day, that particular man had a massive heart attack and was in hospital for a few days and unable to sit on a committee where I think he was intending to block my registration as a doctoral student. You know, it's an amazing story, and all I can say is that I think somehow or other Providence protected me at that moment, and that Sister Clotilde may have had a hand in it.
That's an amazing story, and we're going to get more to that in a second. When I read that, I was just struck by it. So I want to return to that. I want to ask you a little bit. In secondary school, you've said that you were pushed very hard to excel. You were engaging in university level work at a young age. And you said this was rooted in as you said, I'll quote you, in a theology that took seriously the proposition that from those to whom much is given, much will be expected. So
Yes.
how has that expectation impacted you to this very day? How has that ethic that was trained into you, got into your marrow, how has that guided you to this day? And then I want to ask you if you feel like that expectation is lost in the modern schools and universities, or is there a residual of it? What's your sense?
My sense is that it's largely lost. Unfortunately, I think that in many Catholic schools, the ethos became one of wanting to promote the upward social mobility of Catholics. And so, you know, the attitude was, well, we'll take your children and we'll give them a good education and we'll try and get them into good universities. And the whole focus became a very secular focus, whereas the nuns who taught me, they really had this notion that, you know, the meaning of life is about getting to heaven. And so they were much more interested in the spiritual formation of children. And for those of us who were particularly bright, they thought, okay, we really have to make sure that these ones know that to those who much has been given, much will be expected. And they didn't treat every child exactly the same way. If they thought that some children were particularly gifted, either with music or maths or the humanities in my case, they really tried to do their best to extend those students in those areas.
That individualization that you've mentioned, you've written about that as well. Talk about, I mean, it's an amazing thing to consider how much they would have to have gotten to know you, not only your aptitudes, but your interests, and almost discerning along with you a vocation that you are finding your way along at a young, impressionable age. That degree of interest, even though there are high standards, I imagine that really warmed you in terms of their investment in you as a total person. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it wasn't just one particular nun. Sister Clotilde was the standout character, but you know, there were a whole team, and I was just very, very blessed. And I think I came into the world at a time when that particular world was dying. You know, when people who were blessed to be taught by holy religious, we were like the last to have that experience.
Oh, it's amazing. It's amazing. Tracey, you've had as you mentioned or alluded to earlier, you have a decorated university education from august institutions, a degree in law and government, graduate degrees in philosophy, political philosophy, the German language. Found yourself at Cambridge, interested in writing your dissertation on 20th century theological engagements with the idea of culture, so with a special emphasis on Alasdair MacIntyre, Henri de Lubac, and Joseph Ratzinger. I want you to flesh out that story where you had to navigate this interest in this theological, cultural dissertation, but you had to navigate this in a university setting which had Marxist sympathies and a head of faculty who was an ardent atheist and a personal enemy, if I'm not mistaken. I think you've described it as a nemesis of Alasdair MacIntyre. To unfold the story of your approaching him and kind of what you were anticipating and where you ended up in that respect.
Yes. Well, I think to backtrack just a little bit, when I wrote my master's dissertation, I went to Poland and lived in Poland for most of 1989, which was the extraordinary year when the Berlin Wall collapsed.
Wow.
And people were liberated finally from decades of Soviet servitude. And in Poland, I was writing about the ideas of the anti-Marxist intellectuals who were writing about the sort of society they wanted to replace Marxism. And at the time, Francis Fukuyama had written this famous article saying, "We're now all liberals." And I wrote a thesis saying, no, that's not true, because the leaders of the anti-Marxist opposition in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, and in Hungary were all wanting to replace communism with some form of Christian democracy. And so that was my thesis. But I guess that thesis integrated a treatment of liberalism with Christian political philosophy. And in that process, I discovered the work of Alistair MacIntyre. So I decided really that I wanted to work on MacIntyre for my doctoral dissertation. And when I went to Cambridge, I was parked in a department that was called the Department of Social and Political Sciences. And that department was created in 1968 or thereabouts by the Vice-Chancellor, because he had all of these Marxists and other troublemakers in different humanities departments. And so his administrative solution was to take the people out of these various departments and quarantine them in one super kind of radical department. And I found myself there. And,
oh boy.
And it was a complete nightmare. And I was really, I was really bailed out by the so-called radical orthodoxy people in the divinity school, Catherine Pickstock and John Milbank, who made it possible for me to move out of this crazy department and to get into the divinity school, where people were allowed to believe in God, But that process was quite a process.
By the way, is your dissertation available? I mean, is it widely available?
It became published as the book Culture in the Thomist Tradition.
Oh, great.
So Routledge published it, I think, in 2003.
Great. Great. Tracey, you've since completed 2 pontifical degrees, served 16 years as Dean of the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family before becoming the current St. John Paul II Chair of Theology at University of Notre Dame, Australia. Writing 8 books, countless chapters, and all these articles. Describe for us some of the work of which you are most proud and most passionate, and specifically with an angle for those who are listening to you and haven't had as much familiarity with your excellent work. What of Professor Rowland's should everyone read? And I know it's hard to. I know it's going to require you to be maybe put yourself out there and not be too humble, but it's outstanding work. I'm just curious about what have you felt most moved by that you have worked on? Okay,
I think the work that I've most enjoyed writing, at least, was the latest book, which is called The Munich Defense of Christian Humanism, Beyond Kant and Nietzsche. And I so enjoyed working on that because I was looking at the German scholars whom Joseph Ratzinger had described as being the intellectual heroes of his youth. So this required me to backtrack through Catholic journals that were published in Germany between the 2 world wars. And the material I uncovered was just extraordinary. In that period, there were some really great German Catholic intellectuals, and they were contending on the one hand with the tradition of German idealism, with Kantian philosophy, and on the other hand, they understood that the greatest contemporary challenge to Christianity was really coming from the direction of people like Friedrich Nietzsche, who were offering an alternative humanism a humanism without the cross. And that they understood that this was going to be the real challenge. And I think that in the 1960s, especially in 1968, when there's this cultural revolution in the world, it's the Nietzschean values, the Nietzschean understanding of humanism, which really becomes dominant. And so I really enjoyed undertaking that research, and when I reread the chapters in that particular book, I think these people really have the ideas that we need today to deal with the problems we're dealing with today. So I think that's really valuable. But the little book that I love the most is the Portraits of Spiritual Nobility book, because that's just a collection of short essays that I've written, and it gave me an opportunity, I guess, to talk about some of the nuns who taught me in primary school, and also to talk about Father James V. Shaw, who was, like a spiritual father to me. And he was a professor of political philosophy at Georgetown University. Somebody once wrote that students went to Georgetown just to major in Shaw, and I think that's absolutely right. And my story with him was that, I'm an undergraduate at the University of Queensland. I'm a complete nobody, but I loved his work, and I read everything I could find that he had written. And then I go to the United States just as a tourist in 1988. I turn up at Georgetown University, I find my way to his office, and I knock on his door. It never even occurred to me that I should make an appointment. I was so young, so naive. And he was polite, and he said, well, I'm just about to go and take a lecture, but you're welcome to sit in my office and read my books, and when I return, I'll give you a cup of tea. So that was the beginning of my friendship with Father Shaw. And we corresponded, for years on end, sometimes, daily. And, I visited him at Georgetown many times, and he took me to lunch at some restaurant in Georgetown where JFK proposed to Jacqueline, and he said, this is the precise seat in which JFK proposed to Jacqueline. He was a larger-than-life character. And I loved his political philosophy and his ability to look at political philosophy from a Catholic perspective. I think he was a great guy, just a larger-than-life character.
Well, it warmed my heart to learn that he was such an influence on you. And I have, I think, every book he's written right next to every book you've written. So it seems like that's even more apropos. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing to know, because I can see his influence on you. I also want to say to people listening that Tracey's work is so approachable, and yet it is not something that is superficial. So it's amazingly deep, amazingly penetrating into philosophy and faith, but also incredibly approachable, which is not as common among bright academic writers. So I would just endorse everything that you write in that respect. So thank you for that. Segment 2, Meeting Joseph Ratzinger. In the conclusion of your book, Ratzinger's Faith, you quote a passage from Joseph Roth's novel, The Radetzky March. Quote, more than any other quotation, you write, this passage probably reaches to the heart of what animates the theology of Benedict XVI. Now, here's what Joseph Roth writes. In this decaying world, the Roman Church is the only thing left to give shape to life, to help life to keep its shape. Yes, we could even say she dispenses shape. In instituting sin, she is already forgiving it. She does not allow the existence of any faultless human beings. This is the really human thing about her. Thereby, the Roman Church demonstrates her most eminent characteristic, that of pardoning or forgiving. Mm-hmm. So, Tracey, why is this passage, in your eyes, emblematic of Benedict XVI's theology?
I think that Benedict XVI really understands that the Church exists to dispense graces, to dispense the sacraments, to help people to grow into the likeness of Christ. But when we fail, the Church is there as a mother to dispense the sacrament of forgiveness. If you really think about it, it's absolutely awesome that there are, that priests have been given this great gift in the name of Christ to forgive sin. And I think that Ratzinger understands that there is no other institution on the planet that can offer this to humanity.
Yeah.
And so I would say that he has a very deep understanding of sacramentality. For him, the Church is not some international, multicultural or multinational organisation dispensing philanthropy. Sure, we do dispense philanthropy, and that's important, but we do it in a way that's totally different from all other philanthropic institutions. And other organisations on the planet can be philanthropic. We don't have some kind of monopoly on philanthropy, but there's no other organisation in the world that can dispense of sin, forgive people, and there's no other organisation in the world that can turn bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ.
Yeah, so good.
And Ratzinger gets that. I think it really kind of was at the deepest heart of his faith.
Wonderful. Tracey, when did you first encounter the work of Joseph Ratzinger, and how did it first impact you? What were you reading that made you discover the genius of this young priest or this cardinal at the time?
Yeah. Look, it would have been in 1985, and it was when the book The Ratzinger Report came out. And prior to that, I had somehow got onto the Ignatius Press catalogue list. Now, I can't remember precisely how that happened, but for members of my generation in Australia, the way we kind of survived intellectually in those sort of crazy years, the late pontificate of Paul VI, and then moving into the pontificate of JP2, the way we kind of got our bearings was just to read whatever Ignatius Press published. So we kind of had this sense, okay, if Joe Fezio lets something through, then it's probably okay. It's probably trustworthy. So I was one of those who would just read whatever came out through Ignatius, and the Ratzinger Report came out, and I read that. And I thought, this fellow really understands the problems we're dealing with.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's funny because I'm later to the Catholic Church. I converted in 2010, but was on about a 14-year arm wrestling match with both God and my wife over it. It was coming across an old version of the Ratzinger Report, and then ultimately the earlier books of Peter Seawald, the book-length interviews and so on, and just seeing how this man thought. I understand in conversing with Peter Seawald, there weren't a ton of edits. This was the way he talked and thought and articulated himself. And it was so genuine and so engaging and so brilliant and so well formed. It was striking. And so I can see where you're having encountered in its original form, the Ratzinger Report, a stunning encounter with an ingenious spiritual and intellectual mind. I'm curious. It's interesting about your work on this on your most recent book that you were talking about. I think it was in the Munich Defense. You talk about kind of the people that were antecedents to Benedict XVI in terms of thinkers and so on. Tell me a little bit about the mentorship and work of de Lubac, Guardini, and Balthasar in their formation of Joseph Ratzinger. Could you say a few words about that?
Yeah. Well, Guardini was a professor at the University of Munich when Ratzinger was a student there. as far as I'm aware, he didn't actually teach Ratzinger.
Okay.
But he gave homilies at the church, I think it's called St. Ludwig's. It's sort of at the university church, as it were. And his homilies were absolutely famous. And of course, in these German universities, you can turn up to anyone's lectures. You don't have to be enrolled in their course to turn up to their lectures. So certainly Ratzinger saw and heard a lot of Guardini when he was a student in Munich. And Guardini had also been the patriarch of the German Catholic youth movement. He scuttled it when the Nazis came to power, because the Nazis wanted to take it over.
Sure.
So he just dismantled it. Guardini had a great capacity to relate to youth, and I think there were two big concepts in the thought, well, probably three big concepts in the thought of Guardini that influenced Ratzinger. One is that Christianity is primarily about a personal relationship with the Holy Trinity, and everything else flows from that personal relationship. That was one thing. Another thing was the importance of integrating philosophy and theology.
Sure.
Because of the influence of Immanuel Kant on the German education system, there was a sharp divide between philosophy and theology, and people had to work either in one camp or the other. And if you worked in philosophy, you were not allowed to talk about God or revelation. You had to sort of stay in your lane. And Guardini bucked that system, and he had a chair that was called the Chair of the Christian Worldview, which allowed him to integrate theology and philosophy. And so I think that theme of the importance of the integration of faith and reason is very strong in Ratzinger. And then thirdly, Guardini talked about the importance of logos preceding ethos. And he was talking about that before the rise of liberation theology.
Wow.
But, of course, when Ratzinger becomes the prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, he finds himself having to contend with liberation theology. And the most important hallmark of liberation theology is that it flips that relationship and makes praxis or ethos primary. And, that is something that Guardini said was a really bad idea, and that Ratzinger clearly believed was a bad idea. So there's the influence of Guardini. When it comes to de Lubac, as far as I'm aware, Ratzinger first discovers the work of de Lubac when he's a student in Munich, and his lecturer and eventual doctoral supervisor and Habilitationsschrift supervisor, Gottlieb Söhngen, was reading and following de Lubac. And Ratzinger reads de Lubac's book, Catholicism, and he talks about how influential that book was for his understanding of ecclesiology. I'm not across the details of, how the personal relationship between Ratzinger and de Lubac developed. They were both periti at the Second Vatican Council, but Ratzinger was only 35 years old.
Sure.
And although he, was working with Rana, I'm not sure, I don't know if he spent a lot of time working with de Lubac at the council. That's part of the jigsaw I need to examine. But certainly later in life, Ratzinger was to say that the two most impressive people he met were Hans Urs von Balthasar and Henri de Lubac. He just says the breadth of their knowledge of the Catholic intellectual tradition and of, the whole of Western humanities from the Greeks all the way through to the present was just extraordinary, and that nobody else had that kind of cultural capital, and that he learnt so much from the two of them.
Tracy, would you say also when I think about the theology of Joseph Ratzinger and the kind of the return to the sources, the church fathers and so on, was that directly under the influence of these mentors of his or these influence of his? Did he rediscover the church fathers through, again, the homilies and the teachings of Guardini, the teachings and mentorship of de Lubac, the writings of Balthasar? Or did he find his way there independent of them and then found fellow travelers? What's your sense about that?
I think it's definitely the second.
Okay.
People talk about the ressourcement movement and they think France, they think Jean Danelou, they think Henri de Lubac, because de Lubac, had a whole project of translating patristic works into French, and so people just associate ressourcement with a French project. But I think there was a similar movement occurring in Germany at the same time. They just didn't call it ressourcement, but there were certainly a lot of scholars who were interested in St. Augustine at that time, and there were people who were interested in Bonaventure, so it wasn't as if there was a dominance of Thomistic scholasticism as there was in many other parts of the church. I think that in the 19th century there was a movement in the German theological world to engage with the ideas of Romantic philosophy. And of course, the Romantics are interested in history and culture.
Yeah.
And so there was the start of a movement in Germany that was examining themes like history and culture from a Catholic perspective. And that sent them back to the patristics because, of course, it was in the patristic era that many of these issues were treated for the first time. And so I think Ratzinger was really the heir to that sort of tradition in Germany. And I think from his very earliest days as a student, he was interested in Augustine and loved Augustine. So I think he sort of planted himself in patristic soil and then came across people like de Lubac and felt a very strong affinity for them.
Sure. Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization and Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization and Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization and Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, The Pope and Ideology. In his homily before the 2005 conclave, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, serving as Dean of the College of Cardinals, asked, quote, "How many winds of doctrine have we known in recent decades? How many ideological currents? How many ways of thinking? The small boat of the thought of many Christians has often been tossed about by these waves, flung from one extreme to another. Every day, new sects spring up, and what St. Paul says about human deception and the trickery that strives to entice people into error comes true." Tracy, what is ideology, and how did Joseph Ratzinger come to understand its dangers so well?
Yeah. Well, I think ideology is a kind of secular alternative for truth. And, different, when we talk about ideologies, we immediately think of Marxism, fascism. I think that certain forms of feminism are also intensely ideological. And then, of course, we descend into the world of gender ideology and all kinds of so-called critical theory. And I think Ratzinger really understood these problems in an extraordinary way, because most of them start in Germany. You know, so if you think about the intellectual history of the last 500 years, we first of all have the Reformation breaking out in Germany. Then we have the whole 18th century era of the Enlightenment, which has a French dimension, a Scottish dimension, an English dimension, and a German dimension. But I think the German dimension was the most dominant. And then in the 19th century, we have a Romantic reaction to that, which takes both a nihilist direction and a Catholic direction. And then we have the rise of Marxism, and Marxism takes various forms. But I think the most important form in terms of the contemporary world is the form of Frankfurt School critical theory. And Frankfurt School critical theory really attacks the notion of truth, and it really boils down to sort of saying that what people believe to be the truth is dependent upon their position in a class order, and we simply use arguments which we claim to be rational arguments to protect our social positions and promote our own social upward mobility. And, you know, in the context of the church, it takes the form of saying, well, if you look at the people who are the scholars in the church, if you look at the people who work for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, they're all the most highly educated people. They're the people with numerous languages and multiple doctorates. Of course, they're upper middle class people, so their ideas are all tainted by the fact that, you know, they come from this particular social class. Sorry, if you hear crazy scratching noises, that's my cat trying to break into this room.
No problem.
In any event, one thing that I think is very important to understand is that between the two world wars, there was this great Catholic intellectual renaissance in Germany. After World War II, we have a complete cultural collapse in the Catholic world in Germany. Yeah. And I asked a German historian, you know, can you please explain how this could be? And he said, this is my theory. He said, the generation that became the generation of 1968 desperately needed a narrative that could explain how their parents and grandparents could have been complicit in the Nazi atrocities.
Sure.
And he said, people like Guardini, you know, the great Catholic scholars, they didn't write a book about that.
Yeah.
But the Frankfurt School wrote a lot about it. And in particular, there was this book called The Authoritarian Personality. And this book sort of argues that respect for authority, respect for tradition, was a major cause of this calamity, the major cause of the German failure to resist Adolf Hitler. And so the generation of 1968 read The Authoritarian Personality, they read other works by the Frankfurt School, and the Frankfurt School becomes the dominant intellectual tradition of the 1968 generation. And that means that if you even remain a theist, some kind of believer in the Christian God, your interest becomes that of democratizing the church, taking away the Catholic respect for the priesthood, the episcopacy, the papacy. You want to completely democratize, flatten all the structures, and your favorite concepts become concepts like equality and inclusivity. So we end up in the position we're in today with the so-called synodal Weg in Germany. But I have discovered recently an essay by Joseph Ratzinger that, as far as I'm aware, has never been translated into English, where he's highly critical of this movement to democratize the church. And it's a really powerful article.
Tracey, out of curiosity, that the authoritarian personality, that was written by a member of the Frankfurt School? Do you remember who wrote that?
Yes, Theodor Adorno.
Okay, Adorno. Okay,
Yeah,
gotcha.
yeah,
And I know Communio came out of Vatican II, and I know that was after 65 when Vatican II ended. But because, like you said, the 1930s Catholic Renaissance didn't create a book or a kind of a compilation of the mindset of this Catholic intellectual and spiritual Renaissance. It's 30 years later that we could say Communio could be some sort of a version of that. Would you say that's the closest thing to a version of what the 1930s German Catholic Renaissance could say is its legacy, if you will? Or would you say no, it's more of a Vatican II answer as opposed to a continuation of the 1930s Catholic Renaissance? What's your sense about that?
I think it is absolutely a continuation of the 1930s Catholic Renaissance, without any doubt. And in fact, between 1903 and 1972, there was a journal called Hochland, Hochland, and it was a German Catholic journal that was published in Munich. And it was famous for being interdisciplinary. So the idea was it published articles on literature, philosophy, politics, economics, theology. Everything was covered. Even sometimes you can find music scores being published in it. Opera reviews, book reviews. And so it closed in 1972 and Communio began. And one of my colleagues on the International Theological Commission, who is a German national, he said to me, Hochland was the precursor to Communio.
Wow. I don't presume there's any back issues in English, are there?
No, I have bought the entire collection of Hochland. I'm very proud of this. There's no English version of it, but during the COVID lockdown period, when my government in Australia was just the craziest in the entire world, we were locked down here in Melbourne for longer than any other city in the entire world. I ordered the entire collection of Hochland from an antiquarian bookseller in Stuttgart. He sends boxes. You can imagine all these volumes from 1903 to 1972. He puts them in crates, sends them to Australia, and our crazy customs department wouldn't accept them.
Oh, no.
Because they could be contaminated by COVID. And so all these boxes go back to Stuttgart. And then about 6 weeks later, we heard that boxes were getting in from Germany. So he resent them, and this time they got through. So, it was a massive logistical exercise.
Oh, my
gosh. I now have the entire Hochland.
How many is that? I mean, was this a monthly issue or quarterly, or how many issues do you have?
It came out monthly, but then they were bound in a year.
Oh, wow.
So I've got about 5 shelves of a bookcase just filled with Hochlands, and it's just a treasury. And so, I'm starting to mine that. I'm starting to translate particular articles, and it's really great.
I want to be on the short list for those that you're sending out in an English translation. So we know what the rest of your life's work is going to look like in part. So, Tracey, I think it's so fascinating, this intellectual, spiritual ferment of the 1930s, and just this path that Ratzinger, ultimately Benedict XVI, was on, and its impact on all of us. What books and essays, what speeches and homilies of Benedict XVI speak most acutely, and I would say in particular, to the dangers of ideology? Are there? Would you point any of our listeners or me to this work or this homily or this essay? Because I think it's needed now more than ever.
Yeah, I think again, Ignatius Press has been great at translating the homilies and the speeches and putting them together in collections. And one of them is Truth and Tolerance. I'd probably put that at the top of the list. But there are so many really. The speeches he gave in the parliaments of the world when he was a pope. So he gave one to the houses of Westminster.
Yep.
He gave one in the German Bundestag. He gave another one in Paris at the College of the Bernardines in Paris. So, and then there was, of course, the great Regensburg lecture. So in all of these, he's imploring people basically to believe in truth. His constant plea was, we have to govern our lives by the pursuit of truth, not ideologies. Not these partial truths that just end up oppressing people. If you examine every single one of these ideologies, they all end up with internal contradictions, and they all end up making a mess of people's lives. There is nothing redeemable about Marxism, nothing at all, nothing redeemable about fascism. And the current gender ideology stuff is surreal.
For those people who are listening who have not cracked open a work from Benedict XVI or Joseph Ratzinger, it is amazing. It's an immense treasure trove of insider wisdom and commentary and spiritual perspective. And again, Tracey's works are so good at helping to distill those as well as to highlight the life of the man who wrote them or spoke them. Segment 4, The Legacy of a Master. In the academic feature essay for our summer issue of Evangelization and Culture, which is dedicated to the faith and thought of Benedict XVI, Tracey, you made two bold assertions about Benedict's intellectual legacy. The first you wrote is that his works will continue to be read for centuries to come. And the second is that his contribution to the resolution of numerous theological crises will justify a declaration of Doctor of the Church. Tracey, could you just unfold that for us?
Certainly. Well, I think first of all, most of Ratzinger's work is accessible to any faithful Catholic with a secondary school education. In other words, if you are a faithful Catholic, you understand the basics of the faith, you should be able to follow most of Joseph Ratzinger's publications. And in that sense, I think he is like a modern Augustine. One can pick up the works of St. Augustine and read them, and you don't need to be a theologian to understand them. You don't need 12 years of tertiary education. A lot of theologians are very difficult to read without 12 years of tertiary education, but not Ratzinger. So I think that people will be reading Ratzinger for centuries, especially his trilogy on Jesus of Nazareth. I think those 3 books that he wrote about Jesus from what we know through Scripture, his commentary on the Scriptures, I think they will become spiritual classics. When it comes to being declared a doctor of the Church, the normal thing is to be a doctor of the Church, you have to be not only a saint, but someone who's resolved intellectual crises in the life of the Church. Even Saint Therese of Lisieux, St. John Paul II, when he declared St. Therese of Lisieux a doctor of the Church, he argued that her spirituality was precisely the antidote needed in our era. And people have written academic articles saying that Therese of Lisieux is the foil to Friedrich Nietzsche. And so she may not have been a professor, but she sort of came up with a spirituality that was the solution to a lot of problems. With Joseph Ratzinger, people who want to be snooty about him say, oh, he never had his own original ideas, it was just warmed up Augustine or warmed up Bonaventure or somebody else, that he's not an original thinker. And I would say, well, he's not an original thinker if you want to take as originality, developing some new framework that nobody's ever thought of before. but he was a great synthesizer, and I don't think that anyone has quite his capacity for synthesis. You mentioned earlier how he could just talk and everything was coherent.
Yeah.
And many people remark that they would go to conferences in Rome, and at the end of the conference, Ratzinger would just sit at a desk and bring together all the strands of argumentation from 20 different papers.
Wow.
And do it with a great deal of coherence and lucidity, and he would not be working from notes. You know, he would not have written a formal paper. He will just have listened to the other people's papers. He had a great capacity for synthesis. But apart from that, I think what he spent his life doing is attending to intellectual crises in fundamental theology. When I was a child, I used to watch your cartoon about Smokey the Bear, you know, and Smokey the Bear goes around and he's putting out spot fires everywhere. Well, I sometimes think of Pope Benedict as a kind of theological Smokey the Bear who goes around, you know, and there's a problem here and a problem there. And what he does in his books and articles is to say, okay, these are the contending positions, and this is why one position is faithful to the Catholic intellectual tradition, and this is why another position is dangerous.
You know, I was gonna on that note, I was gonna ask you, forgive me for interrupting. Did you get a sense, is there one particular intellectual argument or conflict crisis that you felt he was instrumental in resolving that was particularly healing for the church in your mind? Is there any that jumps out? I mean, I know there were many, but anything that in particular that makes you say that is one he will be remembered for into perpetuity? That's a tough question on the spot.
I think his contribution to the Concilia document De Verbum will be regarded as a huge contribution because it dealt with, you know, the understanding of revelation, and I think that sorted a lot of problems. I also think that he was one of the bravest people in saying that we need to approach the scriptures from the perspective of a hermeneutic of faith, and he you know, he did that at a time when that would have been regarded as the idea of a social dinosaur in many circles in scripture studies. But now it's becoming quite a mainstream position. And it's been helped along a little bit by the work of Gadamer, you know, who talks about this notion of a fusion of horizons. And so I think there he will be regarded as having, you know, turned the ship around in a good direction. In terms of his interventions in liberation theology, I think they're very clear. And people either say, yes, of course, he's absolutely right, or if they've really taken the Marxist bus, then, you know, they're heading in a different direction, and there's really not much one can do about that.
Yeah. Tracey, do you have a sense of the hand of providence in having someone who was deemed by a number as being this older, maybe a caretaker pope, you know, after John Paul II's enormous and lengthy and consequential pontificate? Do you sense this hand of providence that someone like that Joseph Ratzinger, now Benedict XVI, will turn out to be, as you described, at the very least, the Newman of the 20th century?
Yeah. Look, I think he will turn out to be the Newman of the 20th century. Whether he should have been, whether we needed to have him as a pope, I'm not sure on that issue. Like, part of me thinks maybe it would have been better if, say, Angelo Scola, who was regarded as very intellectually close to Ratzinger, and a very entrepreneurial sort of figure, maybe if he had been elected pope, Ratzinger could have been given a job like, could you please go and sort out the problem with the Eastern Orthodox churches? And, because I think he had the capacity to bring that problem to an end.
Wow.
I sort of think if we could just left him in a study somewhere and said, right, your job, next 7 years or whatever, you talk to the Russians, you talk to the Greeks, and let's see if we can sort this.
Wow.
He sorted the problem with the Lutherans on the notion of justification. Yeah, in my mind, I sometimes think maybe if we'd voted for Schola in 2005 and had Ratzinger in a room, and running diplomatic missions to Moscow and to the Greeks, maybe that would have been a better solution. But I do not, I'm just a Catholic writer and an academic. I don't know I don't know the mind of God on these issues. These are works of providence, and it's above my pay grade. But sometimes in my imagination, I just think, maybe if we'd had Angelo Scola and Benedict, working on the front of Christian unity, then maybe that would have been better.
It's an amazing thing to think about the incredibly diverse skill set he had, and it's just a matter of too many skills, too little time. I'm with you in the sense that it would be interesting to know if he had 7 more years or what have you, just to write, like you said, what would he have produced and so on. But it's an incredible consideration. You've been so generous with your time, Tracey. Two final questions. How do you feel the Catholic Church of today has been formed by the faith and thought of Benedict XVI? And you've alluded to some of this with some of the crises he's attended to, some of his commentary on ideology and so on. What is there any way to sum up? And I know this is your life's work, and I'm asking you to sum it up in a paragraph. But how does one say the legacy of Benedict XVI lives on in the modern Catholic Church?
I think it lives on, first of all, in the intellectual formation of priests. All the young priests I know love Benedict, and that's whether they're Americans, Australians, French, German, British. Wherever I go in the world and I meet young clergy, it's as if they have taken Joseph Ratzinger as their theological father.
Wow.
And I think that's powerful. I think that many Catholics who care about the liturgy see him as a source of great inspiration and consolation. He clearly understood that the liturgical developments of the 1970s had been catastrophic in many countries. And although he himself is very much in favour of having the scriptures in the vernacular, in one place he talked about what he would have done, with the liturgy, and it was basically keep it as it was, but put all the scriptural components into the vernacular. And he talked about the pastoral strategy of dumbing everything down to the lowest common denominator so that the most illiterate, poorly educated person in the congregation can follow everything. He talked about that, and he compared it to the Hebrews. The Hebrews' idea of building a golden calf so that people could identify with the golden calf. He said that it's a form of apostasy.
Right.
This idea of trying to bring God down to the level of the people. It's going in the wrong direction. The people need to be lifted up to God. And, his apostolic exhortation, Sacramentum Caritatis, is just beautiful. It's full of the most beautiful phrases about the liturgy and the solemnity of the liturgy and the importance of beauty in the liturgy. And so I think that there are many Catholics who are not really across all the issues in fundamental theology, but they understand that Ratzinger understood their concerns about the liturgy. The people I find just annoy me so much are those who who actually attack Ratzinger,
Yeah.
you know, and say he didn't do enough, or, you know, he was a bad guy. You know, I find that mentality just absolutely infuriating, because it's like you're wanting to shoot the person who did more than anyone else
Yeah.
to deal with the problems you're concerned about.
Yeah. Tracey, how have you personally been changed by this extraordinary shepherd, Benedict the 16th?
Yeah. I think that whenever I read Ratzinger, I feel as though my faith is affirmed. You know, that there is so much evil in the world. There is so much darkness in the church herself, unfortunately, that, you know, that there are times when one is tempted to think, oh, you know, is it all true? And whenever I read Ratzinger, I think, absolutely, it's all true. And so I would say that just reading his work for me has been enormously spiritually consoling.
I can't think of a better answer. That is so good. And I will say personally, I am a product, a Catholic who came into the faith with great help from the readings of Benedict the 16th. And so I would just completely implore all of our listeners out there to really seriously engage with his work and find your faith deepened, riveted by this grand, extraordinary spiritual witness. Professor Tracey Rowland, theologian, author, and champion of the intellectual and spiritual genius of Pope Benedict XVI, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Todd. God bless.
So I've been thinking. When I first came across the mind and faith of Joseph Ratzinger, I was shocked. In an era of appetite and ideology, there was no thinker on the contemporary world stage, to my way of thinking, who even came close to offering the penetrating insights on faith and life like those offered by this Catholic cardinal from Bavaria. And I wasn't even Catholic yet. So, okay, so my admiration for the future Pope Benedict XVI started as a bit of an intellectual man crush. I'll shamelessly admit it. But who could blame me? From his earliest masterwork, Introduction to Christianity, to his Dictatorship of Relativism homily at the opening of 2005 Conclave, from his September addresses at world-renowned centers of thought, to his magnum opus Jesus of Nazareth trilogy, this cardinal who would become pope thoughtfully, charitably, and eloquently wrestled with issues of infinite import. He delved into fundamentals of the Catholic faith as well as sophisticated nuances of Christology. He engaged questions of sound political governance and cultural patrimony. He stirred thinking about the relationship between faith and reason and the dangers of untethered ideology. He penned encyclicals on love and hope, faith and charity, and he filled 4 books with winsome, wide-ranging, and frank discussions with an unreserved German atheist who ultimately credits Benedict XVI with his own conversion to Catholicism. As a Catholic, Benedict XVI had waged moral battle with the Nazis and the communists, debated with arch-conservatives and wayward liberals, championed Vatican II while clarifying what it truly meant, managed the production of the Catholic Catechism, and tightened the language of our weekly Mass. He loved art and music. He reveled in thinking and discussing. But like all of us, Pope Benedict XVI aged and tired. He stepped away from his role as Pontifex Maximus to immerse himself in a humble and quiet life of prayer. On the last day of last year, December 31st, 2022, Benedict XVI slipped from the bonds of earth into the arms of his loving Lord. He died on the feast day of Saint Sylvester, who endured the persecutions of Diocletian before those terrors would end and Emperor Constantine would transform the world. Pope Benedict XVI would be mourned as he requested, in simplicity and in a simple cypress coffin. It is hard to distill in several hundred words what this pope has meant to me. He brought me to the Catholic faith. He reminded me of the robust relationship between faith and reason. He encouraged me to be loving and kind, not simply cerebral and sure. He showed me how Catholics can and should have an intimate friendship with Christ. And finally, as Tracey Rowland confessed about her own extraordinary encounter with the work of Benedict XVI, when I read this great man, My faith is affirmed. In spite of all that the unbelieving world has thrown at Benedict XVI and the unrelenting abuse leveled at the Catholic faith, this man, more than most, has reminded me that my faith is not only comforting, it is true. And today, that is a mighty satisfying reminder. And one last thing. For this week's book, I would recommend Dr. Tracey Rowland's Ratzinger's Faith. This book, along with Peter Seewald's 4 book-length interviews with the Pope, truly opened my eyes to the faith and genius of Pope Benedict XVI. For any who are uncertain about the life and work of this shepherd of the faith, give these books a try. To paraphrase Chesterton, the moment you try to be fair to him, you begin to be fond of him. Once you have done this, let's talk about what to read next. Thank you for listening to the Evangelization and Culture podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to Word on Fire's YouTube channel, leave a review, and share with your friends. And don't forget to get a free copy of Word on Fire's award-winning journal, Evangelization and Culture, at wordonfire.org/journal. Until next time, I'm Todd Warner. Please keep proclaiming Christ to a hungry culture.